Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today we have a shootout between the ultimate Grand Seiko and Rolex dive watches versus starts now. On the left, we have the Grand Seiko 60th Anniversary Pro Diver 600 meter, the SLGA001, a 700-piece titanium limited edition from the 2020 model year. And right next to it, all new for 2018 and the ultimate in Rolex diving tech and spec. This is the Rolex Oyster Perpetual Deepsea Sea-Dweller D Blue 126660. Let's take a look at these two watches, starting with the more familiar of the two. Zoom out a little bit, and we're going to pick up the Deepsea and examine its case first. So the Deepsea Sea-Dweller actually came out in 2008 at Basel World, and it was complemented by what was principally a graphical upgrade. For the 2014 model year. Late in the year, this Deepsea D Blue dial became available, and of course it's also nicknamed the James Cameron because the gradient from blue to black, as well as the signal green, recalls the famous director's personal journey in a submersible of his own design to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean. Of course, you have that gradient from light to dark, but you also have the color of his submersible, the Deepsea Challenger, and that's the signal green of the label. By the way, you will note that Deepsea is actually at the bottom of the dial on the D Blue, whereas it's at the top of the conventional Deepsea Sea-Dweller. The watch is made of 904L stainless steel, highly anti-corrosive, and it does actually have a titanium component, just one, the case back, the only titanium component you will find on a Rolex watch. 44 millimeters in diameter. Things changed for the 2018 model year as there was a reprofiling of the rest of the case. Now, the unchanged dimensions are 44 in diameter and 17.7 millimeters thick, but 51.7 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, and then from end link to end link across the wrist, it is 53.4 millimeters. So that is the absolute distance across the wrist. The bracelet became a little bit broader at its end link, and the lugs became a little bit thinner. So the thickness was taken out of the lugs. The bracelet end link became 22 millimeters, and there's a better match between bracelet size and case size now. We'll zoom out a little bit, throw this on my wrist. My wrist, as you know well, is 16 centimeters in circumference, and I have to say, all things considered, the watch wears well on my wrist. Here, I'll pull out a little bit so you can see the watch in proportion. Both of these would be party watches or no-holds-barred sports watches, leisure watches, casual watches for me. My wrist is small enough that the watch does stand out, and in both cases, the timepieces are colorful, oversized, and designed to be seen when you are above the waves. Here's your cuff shot, here's your down-the-barrel shot, and then here's your over the top. Now, the watch features an Oyster bracelet, a 3-link design, time-honored. This is the Rolex sports bracelet design. Removable links fixed by screws, satin on the top, polished outer faces, and a clasp of surpassing quality. You can see there are actually 2 locks. There's a beacon to hook internally. That's the lift lock. That's the first latch. Here's the second. There's a little kerf underneath the crown so you can dig your nail in to pop open the clamshell. And then you can see that there's a reason I call this Rolex's best clasp. Not just dive clasp, best clasp, period. The Glidelock system that gives you 20 millimeters worth of 2 millimeter increments in a standard Submariner or Sea-Dweller here can be adjusted while the watch is still on the wrist. The trap door opens, and now I have the ability to adjust through 10 2 millimeter increments. So if I want to change the size or the fit, I can easily do so. Now, if I need more extension, I also have the Fliplock system, whereby I can actually pop the extension open, achieving a little bit over 50 millimeters of total adjustable range. So for those of us in the old colonies, that is 2 inches and deeply impressive. And I'll also say, as small as these components are in cross-section, this feels remarkably solid. Even fully extended, there's really no play, ropiness, or impression of cheapness. It's as solid as the clasp, fully assembled and fully compressed, and that is no mean feat. Jumping back to the case itself, we have the polished sides and the squared off lugs that you'll identify with the Super Case generation of Rolex watches that started rolling out with the GMT in 2005. Integration of a helium escape valve. Since the original Sea-Dweller prototypes, this was a device designed to help saturation divers who may experience a buildup of helium inside their watch while they're diving. Now, helium, it will exit the watch very slowly as you ascend, and generally not as quickly as you do ascend. So when the internal pressure exceeds external by 2 to 3 bar, this valve automatically opens up and releases any helium that might build up in the watch. 12,800 feet, 3,900 meters. Put aside the conversion factors for a moment, because I know it's approximate, and just consider that this watch is tested at Rolex to 125% of its rated depth. That is extraordinary and certainly surpasses anything any human being, even the most physically conditioned or acclimated, could ever experience with bare skin. Of course, the timepiece features that lovely lacquer dial that becomes more beautiful the closer you get. White gold hands, white gold indices, a wonderful glossy, lustrous base, and then the ring lock system. You can actually see there is a little bit of advertising, and by that I mean a lot, on this dial. Between the text on the dial and the text on the ring that underpins the nearly 6mm thick sapphire, there's a lot going on, but it is all practical. The gas escape valve is here. The ring lock system is a cylindrical sandwich that has the 5.9mm thick sapphire on the top and the titanium case back on the reverse side, and in between there is a steel cylinder that actually compresses. As the water gets deeper and the pressure grows, the watch actually becomes more water resistant. Ceramic bezel insert, the little indices as well as characters, the numerals, those are all platinum deposits inside the ceramic insert, the ceramic making it very scratch tolerant. 120 clicks, wonderfully refined, a handsome, aesthetically pleasing set of sights, sounds, and feels, as the tactile quality of this bezel absolutely superb, managing to be both mechanical and chunky and silky and refined. Now, the timepiece does include a trip lock crown, screw down, and Rolex caliber 3235. What you need to know is stop seconds, quick set date, anti-magnetic niobium zirconium hairspring, highly shock resistant with a full balance bridge and a free sprung index, and of course a 70-hour power reserve. Rolex taking the COSC chronometer certification of the bare movement, casing the watch up and ensuring it'll run no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per 24 hours. A very impressive feat. Now, +2 -2 with a purely mechanical watch is indeed impressive. This watch, however, can achieve ±10 seconds, wait for it, per month. That's right. That's spring drive. Launched in 2020 as a 700-piece limited edition, the SLGA001 celebrates 60 years of the Grand Seiko mark. Now, the timepiece is physically imposing, bigger, at least at face value, than the Deepsea. We'll zoom out a little bit so you can get a sense of it in proportion after we take a quick look at the facets of the case. This is a grade 5 titanium case, so lighter than steel, but also more scratch resistant, and the high polish is executed against a spinning tin plate by hand and eye coordination. So this is a hand-finished case. Grand Seiko calls this Zaratsu polish, and it's done on a Zalitz machine. But that case needs to be titanium because it's 46.9mm in diameter. However, it is thinner than the Deepsea by 2.1mm. It is 15.6mm thick, so surprisingly svelte, and that's because the new 9RA5 movement is actually 0.8mm thinner than the previous spring drive. So technical sophistication, also packaging improvements. From lug to lug, the watch is 51mm, so very similar to the Deepsea, but from end link to end link, it's a little bit broader at 54.4. Still, these watches are within 1mm of each other across the wrist. 23mm spacing between the lugs, and you may want to know that because you can see there are traditional strap tools on Grand Seiko divers, the idea being that you will use your strap tool to swap out to a strap, and this watch does have an accessory silicone strap in blue that is included with the box. Throw it on the wrist, and the first thing you notice is that it's a lot lighter. Titanium, both bracelet and case, means that eyes closed, you'd guess maybe 42mm, although visually it takes up just as much space as the Rolex, and it's a little bit broader across the wrist. So for me, the fit of the Rolex is a tiny bit better, though you do notice the difference in thickness. As thick as both of these watches are, the Deepsea's really in a class by itself, and this comes across as just a tiny bit more compact. Now, the watch has a titanium bracelet that's nicely made, but you can feel, eyes closed, that it's not the equal of the Rolex Oyster in solidity. You can also see that it uses pins and sleeves for sizable links, so this is something that, frankly, for the price, which is $11,000 new, we should see reverted to screws, because Grand Seiko, for whatever reason, regardless of price, uses pins and sleeves on titanium bracelets and screws for removable links on steel bracelets. Now, the clasp here is to be lauded for its functionality and its security. You can see there is both a trigger release system and then a clamshell lock on top. So in that sense, it's similar to the Deepsea in that there are two locking mechanisms for the clasp. Now, you can also adjust this clasp while it's on the wrist by opening it up and then pulling these two little tabs that flank the inner clasp. So you pull them up, and then you can make adjustments Well, the system is on your wrist. You can adjust in or out. You can see it's fully incremental, unlike the Rolex system, which actually has a fold-out component to it. And this system is also designed to be sized in a sensitive marine environment, just like the Rolex, where the consequence of taking the watch off the wrist in order to make a sizing change could result in accidentally dropping it. So being able to make these adjustments on the wrist is a big deal. And the incremental adjustment is nice. It would be nice to have the same total range of adjustability that you get with the double extensions of the Rolex, however. Now, the case is gorgeous and it's distinctive. This will never be described as inelegant. It is highly technical with facets and curves, creases and curves too, polish and satination, handsomely hand finished. This is a handmade watch in a way that the Rolex, principally machine finished, is not. Now, the bezel insert here is ceramic and it is a 120 click bezel. And it's very precise. And it's less mechanical, and I would say a little bit more refined in total smoothness. If the Rolex is cold butter, this one's a little bit more like warm or melted butter. It doesn't have those sharp detents, and I do miss them a little bit, but the overall feel of refinement is entirely competitive with the Rolex. It's going to come down to taste. The dial is a metallic blue that is a Grand Seiko corporate color. To remind you, 60 years young. The brand has been around and established traditions in that time. The hands at center, which are alternately broad arrow and cathedral for the hour hand, a rare use of a cathedral hand on a dive watch. They're satinated on their top. All of the rest of the dial furniture has been hand polished on micrometric milling tools that help to achieve the shine on these indices. So hand finished dial furniture as well. Though you can't quite see it, I'll demonstrate this underneath the hour hand. There is a power reserve indicator, and because it is always nice to know your dive watch isn't about to drop dead when you put it on the wrist, I appreciate the presence of a power reserve indicator here. Now, this watch, 600 meters water resistant, Grand Seiko, of course, boasting that this being a professional dive watch, helium cannot enter the case, therefore it needs no provision for helium escape. That is their premise. Rolex takes a different route, but the power reserve indicator lets you know your watch is not ready to give up the ghost just before dive, and I consider it a worthy safety feature. Spring drive. Of course, it is a quartz oscillator, but entirely mechanical drive and energy, so you have this continuously smooth glide to the seconds hand that you don't get, for example, on a mechanical watch. Of course, upgraded. The 9R-A5 movement for 2020, no longer a 3-day power reserve, now a 5-day with twin mainspring barrels. You have the quick set for the date, the hacking seconds, the extraordinary precision of plus or minus 10 seconds per month, and all this driven by 2 barrels, so it has long legs, automatic winding, a very impressive technical achievement. So let's talk about what these watches have to their credit in terms of advantages. We'll start with the Rolex. So the Rolex obviously has name recognition and brand equity on its side. If luxury watches include, even in part, a status role in your conception of your collection, if you're one who thinks that the watch's brand name really does carry some currency and you'd like that recognized, this is going to be it. And Rolex is the only watch brand in our weird niche hobby that's on par with the likes of Apple, Coca-Cola, Rolls-Royce, brand names and household names that people know even if they don't own the product and don't follow the industry. This is a name that is transcendent. I would also say it's the one to buy new. This is a watch that costs $12,900 new, and if you sell it right after buying it new, it's going to sell for about $17,500. So that's a big deal. If you're on the wait list and the offer comes along, you get that call from the dealer, pick it up even if you don't want it. It's worth getting. Wear it for a year, enjoy it, and then sell it at a profit. It is a deeper diver, and it's not close, 3,900 meters to 600 meters. And if I had to bet, over the long run, I would say that you're probably safer with a true helium escape valve than counting on factory seals remaining hermetically sealed against helium, which is a tiny, tiny elemental molecule. I really don't think that 3 or 4 years down the line, this is still going to be helium-proof, where I do think 3 or 4 years down the line, this valve is still going to work just fine. In terms of warranty, this watch is 5 years, this watch is 3 years, advantage Rolex. I would also say that it feels stronger and better built. The bracelet feels more structurally imposing. The clasp feels as though it were hewn from a solid ingot of steel, and even the extension components and the moving parts of the clasp feel just as impressive as the clasp as a whole. The case itself feels indestructible, and while some of this is the illusory quality of steel being compared to titanium, nevertheless the Rolex in the hand and on the wrist feels multiples of its asking price. I would also say bezel feel. By a small margin, I like having a little bit more metallic detent. Feeling and hearing those detents does carry some value when you are adjusting the bezel. And I'd also say that realistically, the watch is a slightly better fit for me. Being narrower across the wrist, somehow this one comes out ahead in spite of being heavier. I really do think that in spite of being heavier and thicker, the Deepsea was the easier watch to fit on my wrist, which means if your wrist is my size or smaller, you're going to want the Deepsea. And I'd also say that regardless of whether the Deepsea has a long history, it goes back to 2008, but its design language is borrowed from older sea dwellers and submariners, which means that here there is no planned obsolescence. Even the celebrity association with James Cameron, it's devoid of any cues that anchor it to the man himself. Obviously, the colors are there, but they're handsome regardless of whether you know the backstory, so it has not been celebrity branded. It's just a good-looking watch that carries the design traditions of Rolex dive watches since time immemorial, so there is no planned obsolescence here. It will look great in decades to come. With the Grand Seiko, lots to love. It is lighter on the wrist and it is thinner, and if those are your priorities, this is going to be your watch. I would also say no Rolex brand baggage. To the wider world, Grand Seiko means Seiko, which means you're not going to draw a lot of undue attention, and the people who do know what the SLGA001 is are going to be fun folks to know and meet. I would also say power reserve. Any day of the week, 120 hours beats 70 hours, so that's that. Precision. Plus or minus 2 seconds per day. This one's actually rated at plus or minus 0.5 seconds per 24 hours, but it actually comes out per Grand Seiko to 10 seconds a month. So big advantage with Grand Seiko, and not just quartz precision here, but it is a thermocompensated quartz, meaning it has a lot of the same qualities as super quartz movements that are chronometer certified. So this deserves to be mentioned in that company, and very impressive stuff right there. This is a hand-finished case. The Rolex is not hand-finished. Rolex dials do still involve some hand assembly, but the cases of Rolex watches are machine polished. This is all done artisanally. Big advantage, Grand Seiko. I would also say rarity. Now, true, there aren't enough Rolex steel dive watches to go around these days, but 700 is 700, and Rolex will make thousands of dive watches each year, including Deepseas. So this one is a much scarcer piece, and of course, limited edition and discontinued. I would also say the power reserve indicator. I think it's one thing to know your dive watch is running, another to know that it's nowhere near stopping, and with the power reserve indicator, you get that. Plus, you get a bit more value and complexity. Obviously, the accessory strap that comes with this watch, as well as its suitability for straps, gives it an aesthetic and ergonomic flexibility that you don't get with the Rolex. Even if you buy a rubber B, that's not factory equipment. That's something you have to go out and buy separately. Here, the watch is well suited for straps, and they actually throw one into the box, so I like that. In terms of lume, it's definitely Grand Seiko over Rolex, and you're going to see that in a moment when we jump to the lume shot. This is the utilitarian winner. Lighter, more scratch resistant, a longer power reserve, and better lume at a lower price. If we were speaking purely in rational terms, the Grand Seiko is the better dive watch. But these are luxury watches, and an article of luxury should impress its owner first and foremost, doing more than expected, and, if possible, feeling more expensive than it is. This is my choice. Now, I recently compared this exact model to the Seamaster Planet Ocean, and the Planet Ocean came out on ahead. But the Planet Ocean feels just as luxurious in the hand as the Rolex, whereas the Grand Seiko does not. The Planet Ocean's bracelet and clasp are the equal of this Rolex. The Grand Seiko's are not. So this watch, bezel feel, bezel sound, bracelet feel, the sound it makes when you rattle it, the feel of the clasp, the total adjustability of the clasp, the solidity and finishing of the case, even machine finished, it's still that impressive. Overall, this is a watch that feels as tough as some of the Richard Mille dive watches, like the RM25, the RM32 that I've put on my wrist. And considering the price delta between those and this, it gives you an impression of just how redoubtable, vaunted, stunning, spellbinding this Rolex watch is, just in terms of what you feel when it's in your hand or on the wrist. And the fit, in spite of the thickness, all those things make the Rolex my choice between these two, but this is one of the closest verses I have ever had to call. There is no wrong answer, and I want to know your answer, so let me know in the description below the video which of these two would you take. Price, no object. One last note, this watch is $11,000 new. Pre-owned, it sells for about $11 to $12, so you're not looking at big depreciation with either of these timepieces. And we're back with the two in the dark. As you can see, it's very close, but to the naked eye, that is not the camera lens, the Grand Seiko is a bit brighter.